When I discovered the HOA president was slowly poisoning my mom's water supply, I didn't just get mad, I got even by buying their water rights and cutting them off completely. I never thought my life would revolve around fighting an HOA, but here I was, standing in my front yard, gripping a garden hose, watching Karen Whitfield's shiny SUV pull up like a vulture circling its next meal. My name is Adonis Morrison, and I take care of my mother, Margaret Morrison, in the home my father built with his own hands. I'm a craftsman, a problem solver, and someone who minds his own business, until you mess with my family. Mom had lived in Maplewood Estates for 25 years, long before Karen and her power-hungry HOA cronies turned it into their personal kingdom. This neighborhood used to be a place where people helped each other. Now, it was a battleground of fines, regulations, and Karen's obsessive need for control. I turned off the hose just as Karen rolled down her window, her signature fake smile plastered across her face. "Adonis, we need to talk about your lawn decorations." I exhaled, gripping the hose tighter. It was always something. A mailbox color, a wind chime, now the garden gnomes my father gave Mom every year. I wasn't one to start fights, but I sure as hell wasn't going to let anyone push us out of our home. I stared at the notice in my hands, my blood boiling with frustration. $200 per garden gnome. 8 gnomes. That was $1,600 in fines. For what? A handful of ceramic figures that had been sitting in my mother's garden for years? I clenched my jaw as I reread the notice, signed, of course, by Karen Whitfield, HOA president. The audacity of this woman knew no bounds. I stormed into the house, my fingers tightening around the paper like it was Karen's smug face. Mom was resting on the couch, looking weaker than usual. The stress of these constant battles was wearing her down. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice soft, tired. I forced a smile, not wanting to upset her. "Just HOA nonsense again." Her eyes flicked to the paper in my hands. "The gnomes?" I nodded. She sighed, sinking deeper into the couch. "They were your father's favorites." That was the moment frustration turned into outrage. They weren't just trying to enforce some ridiculous rule, they were erasing my father's memory, piece by piece. First the gnomes, then the bird feeder, then the wind chimes. It was a slow, calculated attack designed to break us down. I took a deep breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wasn't just going to roll over and let this happen. I stormed back outside, looking at the garden, our garden. My father had poured his heart into this space, planting every flower, setting every stone. Now, because of Karen's insatiable thirst for control, I was supposed to rip it apart. No. I refused. I grabbed my phone and started recording. "This is Adonis Morrison. My family has lived here for 25 years. My mother is sick, and instead of compassion, the HOA is fining us $1,600 over garden gnomes. My father gave my mother these every year before he passed. Now, they want them gone. This is not about rules, this is about power." I uploaded the video and hit post. If Karen wanted a war, she just got one. I woke up to chaos. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating, notifications flooding in like an avalanche. 3,000 shares. 10,000 views. Hundreds of comments. My video had gone viral overnight, and people were furious, not at me, but at Karen Whitfield and her HOA tyranny. This is disgusting. Who finds a sick woman over garden gnomes? This HOA sounds like a dictatorship. Fight back, Adonis. Let's all send this family gnomes and see what Karen does about it. I smirked at that last one. Oh, that would drive Karen insane. I was still scrolling through the comments when I heard tires screech outside. I peered through the curtains and saw Karen's sleek black SUV, parked at an awkward angle in my driveway. She stormed out, her signature clipboard in hand, her face twisted in barely contained rage. I stepped outside before she had the chance to bang on my door. "Morning, Karen," I said, my voice laced with fake politeness. She thrust a printed document at me. "This is an official cease and desist notice. Remove the video immediately, or we will pursue legal action." I took my time unfolding the paper, scanning the legal jargon. It was nonsense. Nothing in here actually held weight, it was just an intimidation tactic. I looked up, smiling. "So, let me get this straight, you're threatening me over a video, but you have no problem issuing $1,600 in fines over harmless garden decorations?" Her nostrils flared. "Community rules exist for a reason, Mr. Morrison. You agreed to them when you moved here. My parents moved here 25 years ago. And guess what? This HOA didn't exist back then." She pursed her lips. "You don't want to make an enemy of me, Adonis." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "Karen, you already made an enemy of me the day you disrespected my family. I'm not backing down." Her mouth opened like she was about to say something, but she thought better of it. With a final glare, she stomped back to her SUV, slamming the door so hard her mirrors rattled. As she sped away, I pulled out my phone and hit record again. Looks like Karen didn't like the truth. But I'm just getting started. The first sign that something was wrong came when I stepped outside the next morning and found my water running brown. I twisted the faucet off and on again, but the murky sludge that poured from the spout didn't change. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. "Karen." Grabbing my phone, I started recording. "Would you look at that? My water suddenly looks like a toxic waste dump. But I bet if I check my neighbors' houses, theirs will be perfectly fine." I was halfway through filming when a white utility truck rolled past my house. It slowed just enough for me to recognize the logo, the Pinecrest HOA Maintenance Division. My blood ran cold. I had never seen an HOA maintenance truck in my life. They didn't fix anything, they fined you until you fixed it yourself. Something wasn't right. I shoved my phone in my pocket and hopped into my truck, following the van from a distance. It took a winding path through the neighborhood, stopping outside a gated section of Pinecrest I rarely visited, the board members' cul-de-sac. I parked on the street and watched from behind my windshield. Two men in matching uniforms hopped out, opened a maintenance hatch near the sidewalk, and fiddled with something underground. Then, a terrible realization struck me. They weren't fixing anything. They were redirecting the water supply. To test my theory, I doubled back to Elaine Rodriguez's house, one of the few neighbors who had supported me against the HOA. When I knocked, she answered in her robe, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Her water was fine. I raced home and checked my faucets again. Still brown sludge. Karen was playing dirty. She'd cut me off, manipulating the water system to make my life unbearable, hoping I'd break under the pressure. But she underestimated me. I dug out my property papers and spread them across my kitchen table. If she wanted a war, I was about to give her one, and I wouldn't lose. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rushing water, but not from inside my house. Still groggy, I pulled back the curtain and froze. My front yard was flooded. Water gushed from the street, spilling over my driveway like a busted dam. The air smelled damp and metallic, and the soft earth beneath my mailbox had turned into a murky swamp. I threw on my boots and stormed outside. The water was pouring from an open fire hydrant, just a few feet from my property line. Karen. Again. Across the street, a group of HOA board members stood watching, pretending to inspect their own flower beds while stealing glances at the mess in my yard. I clenched my jaw and walked straight toward them. "Having a nice morning?" Karen turned, wearing her usual smug expression. "Oh, Adonis, dear," she said, feigning concern. "It looks like there's been a water line break. How unfortunate." We'll have to fine you for excessive standing water. It violates Section 14 of the HOA Environmental Code. I saw red. Are you serious? This is coming from your hydrant. Karen gave me a slow, satisfied smile. It's on the community line, dear. Not our responsibility. The other board members chuckled, nodding along. I wanted to scream. Instead, I forced myself to stay calm. I pulled out my phone, turned on the camera, and filmed the ankle-deep water swallowing my front yard. Then, I slowly panned over to the hydrant gushing like a fountain. Are you getting this, Karen? I asked, zooming in on her face. Because I am. And so will the city water department. Karen's smile faltered just slightly. She wasn't expecting me to fight back so quickly. Don't worry, I continued, flipping the camera to selfie mode. I'm sure the county inspector will love to hear how the Pinecrest HOA is selectively targeting homeowners by weaponizing the water system. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving her board members scrambling to follow. I looked back at my ruined yard, rage simmering beneath my skin. This wasn't just a battle anymore. This was war. That evening, as I sat at my desk reviewing my mother's medical reports, I realized something: the HOA's reign of terror only worked because people were too afraid to fight back. Karen and her board counted on silence. They counted on fear. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had evidence. I had witnesses. And most importantly, I had a plan. I spent the next 2 days gathering everything I could find: photos of the open fire hydrant, security footage of Doug near our water meter, the lab reports confirming ethylene glycol in our water supply. I printed every HOA fine and violation notice, highlighting the ridiculous charges they'd levied against my mother and me. Then, I knocked on every door in the neighborhood. At first, people hesitated to speak up. Some glanced around nervously, afraid of being seen talking to me. But as I showed them the lab results, the video footage, the pattern of targeted harassment, something shifted. Elaine, the elderly widow from 2 streets over, burst into tears. They poisoned your mother, she whispered. My husband got sick last year, no one could figure out why. And Karen kept pressuring me to sell after he died. Jennifer, the woman with the denied wheelchair ramp, clenched her fists. They've been getting away with this for too long. By the end of the night, I had 15 neighbors on my side, ready to fight back. The next morning, we marched into the county commissioner's office together. A receptionist tried to turn us away, but we refused to leave. We're reporting a criminal HOA, I said, slamming my folder of evidence onto the desk. Within the hour, a formal investigation was launched. By noon, a news crew was knocking on my door. By nightfall, our story was already spreading: homeowners accuse HOA of poisoning residents' water. And for the first time in months, I felt it. Power. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for all of us. And I wasn't going to stop until Karen and her corrupt empire crumbled. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. The weight of what we had done, what we had started, settled on my shoulders. The HOA was finally being investigated, but I knew Karen wasn't going to go down quietly. She was like a wounded animal, and that made her more dangerous than ever. The first sign of retaliation came at dawn. I stepped outside to get the mail and froze. My front door was covered in red spray paint. Liar. Troublemaker. The words screamed at me from the wood, a sickening reminder that Karen and her people weren't done with me yet. My stomach twisted as I checked the mailbox. Inside was a final notice from the HOA, claiming I owed over $8,000 in unpaid fines and that my home would be subject to a lien within the month. I clenched my fists, rage rising like fire in my chest. They were trying to bankrupt me. But they didn't realize I was already 10 steps ahead. I grabbed my phone and called Jennifer, the woman they had refused to let install her wheelchair ramp. "They're trying to force me out," I said. "We need to act before they do." Within the hour, our group had doubled in size. More neighbors stepped forward with their own stories: suspicious illnesses, stolen property, outrageous fines for minor violations. Elaine found county zoning records proving that the HOA had made illegal changes to community infrastructure, rerouting drainage and sewage systems to save money. Michael, the solar panel guy, uncovered financial discrepancies in the HOA's budget reports. "We need to go public," I said, my mind racing. The news station was already interested in our story. If we could expose Karen and her board to the entire city, they wouldn't be able to hide behind their lies anymore. By midnight, we had a plan. And when the morning sun rose, Karen Thompson would wake up to a war she never saw coming. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried change on the wind. Today was the day Karen Thompson would finally get what was coming to her. I stood at the edge of the crowd gathered outside the HOA office, my arms crossed as neighbors whispered among themselves. Word had spread like wildfire overnight. The local news station had aired our story, exposing the corruption, the stolen money, the poisoned water, the illegal fines. Karen's carefully curated world was crumbling, and we were all here to watch it fall. At exactly 9 a.m., 2 black and white patrol cars rolled up, their lights flashing but sirens silent. The hush that fell over the crowd was almost reverent as the officers stepped out and approached the HOA office doors. Karen burst out before they even knocked, red-faced and flustered, still clinging to whatever power she thought she had left. "This is harassment," she screeched. "You have no right to be here. This is private property." One of the officers, Detective Martinez, the same one who had once dismissed my claims as circumstantial, held up a warrant. "Karen Thompson," he said, his voice steady. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit environmental crimes." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone actually cheered. Karen staggered back as if she'd been slapped. You can't be serious." "Oh, we're serious," Detective Martinez said, stepping aside as 2 uniformed officers moved in. The moment her manicured hands were cuffed behind her back, I felt something inside me settle, a weight lifting, a balance restored. "You did this," she spat as they led her to the squad car. Her wild eyes locked onto me, rage and disbelief warring in her expression. I took a slow step forward, tilting my head. "No, Karen," I said, voice calm. "You did this to yourself." As the doors slammed shut and the car pulled away, the crowd erupted into cheers. And just like that, the reign of Karen Thompson was over. The day after Karen's arrest, the fallout began. I sat on my porch, drinking coffee, watching as the news trucks rolled into the neighborhood like a pack of hungry wolves. The entire HOA board was in shambles, half of them were either resigning, lawyering up, or outright disappearing. Malcolm Reed, the spineless treasurer, had gone radio silent. Doug Thompson, Karen's husband and resident accomplice, had been slapped with separate charges after investigators found a hidden ledger detailing off-the-books fines and kickbacks from contractors. But the real fireworks started when the remaining HOA members attempted damage control. An emergency meeting was called that evening at the community center. I walked in expecting a fight, but what I found instead was a room full of frightened people, neighbors who had once turned their backs on me now whispering among themselves, worried about what this meant for them. Malcolm stood at the podium, sweating bullets. "We understand that mistakes were made," he started, his voice quivering. "But we can move forward as a community if we resign." I didn't even have to raise my voice. My words cut through the air like a sharp blade. Malcolm blinked, swallowing hard. "Excuse me." "You heard me," I said, stepping forward. "The only way this community moves forward is without any of you involved." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Elaine, one of the few board members with a conscience, nodded. "He's right," she said. We need new leadership. People who actually care about this neighborhood, not just their power trips and bank accounts. A vote was cast on the spot. Unanimous. The entire HOA board was dissolved right then and there. For the first time in years, Pinecrest Gardens belonged to the homeowners, not to an iron-fisted regime. The people Karen once bullied and exploited now stood together, united. I stepped outside into the cool night air and let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. For the first time since this fight began, I knew we had won. The morning Karen Thompson and Doug were sentenced, I woke up early, sipping my coffee as the sun rose over Pinecrest Gardens. It was a morning of victory, a moment I had fought tooth and nail for, and yet, as I sat there listening to the silence, the absence of threats, the lack of HOA notices taped to my door, I realized something. We had won. The courtroom was standing room only when I arrived. Neighbors, reporters, even former HOA members had come to witness the final chapter of the Thompson reign. Karen sat at the defense table, her once pristine appearance disheveled, her trademark superiority replaced by something else, fear. Doug sat beside her, stone-faced, as though he could still deny his role in the nightmare they had created. The judge took his seat and adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Thompson, you stand before this court charged with multiple counts of conspiracy, fraud, environmental crimes, and reckless endangerment. After reviewing the overwhelming evidence, including recorded admissions, financial statements, and video footage, this court finds you both guilty on all charges. A hush fell over the room. The weight of those words sank in, and I caught the flicker of panic in Karen's eyes. The judge continued. You engaged in a deliberate campaign of intimidation, using your position in the HOA to illegally poison a homeowner's water supply, endangering the life of an elderly woman. You falsified financial records, pocketed homeowner dues for your personal gain, and abused the trust placed in you. Karen opened her mouth, likely to protest, to claim innocence one last time, but the judge wasn't interested. For these crimes, he said, you are each sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with full restitution of all stolen funds and damages. Gasps filled the room. A ripple of murmured reaction spread through the crowd. I felt my chest tighten, not with fear, but with vindication. Karen turned wild-eyed toward Doug, but he wouldn't even look at her. The power couple of Pinecrest Gardens had finally fallen, and this time, there was no way out. As the bailiffs approached, Karen suddenly snapped. This is a mistake, she shrieked. You can't do this to me. I built this neighborhood. I watched as the officers took her by the arms, guiding her away. She fought them at first, then went still, her face drained of color. She knew it was over. Outside the courthouse, neighbors cheered, hugging one another. Elaine embraced me, her voice thick with emotion. It's done, Adonis. It's finally over. I glanced back at the courthouse steps, where the press swarmed, cameras flashing. But I wasn't thinking about the headlines. I was thinking about Mom, finally safe. I exhaled deeply. Justice had been served. The neighborhood had changed overnight. It was palpable, like the moment after a heavy storm when the air is fresh, and everything is still. The fear was gone. The tyranny of Karen Thompson had been uprooted like the weeds she so despised. For the first time in years, Pinecrest Gardens belonged to its residents, not a corrupt, power-hungry board. The emergency HOA meeting that followed Karen's sentencing was unlike any before. No tension, no whispered threats, no fear. The new interim president, Elaine Jenkins, stood at the podium, looking humbled but determined. Today, we begin to fix the damage that's been done, she announced. Effective immediately, all past HOA fines issued under the previous board are voided. If you were unfairly targeted, you are now free. A wave of cheers erupted. Homeowners who had been drowning in unjust fines, exhausted by Karen's reign of terror, clapped, shouted, even cried. For the first time, their voices mattered. I stood near the back, watching. The weight I'd been carrying for months, the fight for Mom, for justice, for the truth, finally lifted. But there was one more thing. Elaine called my name, and I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. I hesitated, but Ted gave me a reassuring nod. Adonis Morrison, Elaine continued, for your tireless fight, for standing up when no one else could, we would like to formally recognize you. She held out a framed document, and as I stepped forward, the room erupted into a standing ovation. I took it in my hands and scanned the words. My breath caught. The Morrison Clause, a permanent exemption from HOA authority. I blinked. I had one more than I ever expected. My home, my land, forever free. Elaine smiled. We also voted to rename the community garden in your mother's honor. From this day forward, it will be known as the Helen Morrison Healing Garden. Tears burned my eyes. Not from pain, or frustration, or anger, but from triumph. The sun was shining brighter than it had in years, or maybe it just felt that way. For the first time in a long time, Pinecrest Gardens was truly a community. Not a collection of houses under the thumb of a ruthless HOA, not a battleground where neighbors lived in fear of fines and retaliation, but a place where people belonged. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Helen Morrison Healing Garden was more than just a dedication, it was a declaration. People gathered in droves, faces filled with hope and relief. A place that had once been ruled by intimidation now stood in defiance of its past, ready to embrace a new future. Mom sat in her wheelchair, tears glistening in her eyes as Elaine and Ted helped her cut the ceremonial ribbon. As soon as the fabric split, a cheer erupted, people clapping, whistling, embracing. It wasn't just a garden, it was a symbol of everything we had fought for. One by one, neighbors came forward, placing garden gnomes along the winding path. Some were new, some had been rescued from Karen's forced purges, but each one told a story. I even spotted our old gnome, the one Dad had bought Mom years ago, nestled among the others. This is for all of us, I said, standing before the crowd. For everyone who's been bullied, fined, silenced. For everyone who thought they had to put up with unfair rules because that's just how things were. This proves we were never powerless. We just had to stand together. A round of cheers and applause followed, and as I looked around, I saw a community that was finally healing. Kids ran through the garden paths, free from the fear of HOA citations for playing too loudly. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down out of fear laughed, talked, shared stories. The final blow to the old HOA came in the form of a petition, signed by over 200 homeowners, to permanently dissolve the HOA. It passed overwhelmingly. The people of Pinecrest Gardens had spoken. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized something: this wasn't just a victory. This was a new beginning.